The November sleet fell like frozen tears from a pewter sky, each droplet striking Louisa McKenna's weathered shawl with stinging precision. She hunched deeper into the freight wagon's wooden seat, her gloved hands gripping the leather reins, as two weary horses plodded through muddy ruts between Willow Springs and Copper Gulch. The vast grassland stretched endlessly on both sides, a brown expanse broken only by scattered cottonwoods, whose skeletal branches clawed at the iron-gray heavens. Read the sky like scripture, Lou girl. Her father's voice echoed in her memory as she studied the approaching storm. Clouds tell you what's coming before the wind knows it. Land speaks to those who listen. William McKenna had taught her to interpret every shift in weather, every change in the grass, every warning the prairie offered to those wise enough to heed its counsel. Now, 6 months after his death, those lessons had become her lifeline. At 23, Louisa had already learned to read the land's moods like scripture. Today's weather promised trouble, the kind that froze bones and made even the hardiest frontier folk seek shelter. But she couldn't afford delay. The tin box secured beneath her seat contained papers representing her entire future. And every passing hour meant another opportunity for Conrad Hale's vultures to circle closer. Her fingers traced the box's worn edges, remembering her father's last coherent words. That creek's more than Waterloo, girl. It's freedom itself. Don't let 'em cage what God meant to flow free. He'd pressed the key into her palm with hands already growing cold, his eyes burning with the intensity of a man who knew his time was measured in hours, not days. The wind shifted, carrying the metallic scent of approaching storm when she spotted them. 3 riders emerged from the swirling mist ahead, blocking the narrow road where it curved around a stand of barren oak trees. Their faces were masked with dark bandanas, and rifle muzzles gleamed dully in the filtered light. The lead rider, a stocky man, whose mount pranced restlessly beneath him, raised his hand in a gesture devoid of friendliness. Louisa's heart began its familiar hammering against her ribs. But alongside the fear came something else. A cold, calculating fury that reminded her she was William McKenna's daughter. Her mind raced through possibilities, turn and run impossible on these rutted roads, try to talk her way past unlikely with men like these, or fight poor odds, but perhaps her only chance. Well, well. The man called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. Louisa recognized the gravelly tone immediately. Hatchet Harry, they called him in Willow Springs saloons, on account of the weapon hanging from his saddle horn, and the stories of what he'd done with it to those who crossed him. Mighty poor weather for a lady to be traveling alone. Her right hand inched toward the small derringer tucked in her coat pocket, a pitiful defense against 3 armed men. But her father had always said courage wasn't about having no fear, it was about acting despite it. The weight of the little pistol against her fingers steadied her voice. The road's free to all last, I heard. Now. Hatchet Harry continued, urging his mount forward until she could see the cruel glint in his eyes above the bandana. Cold, predatory eyes that had looked upon too much suffering without flinching. No need for hostility. We're just concerned citizens looking out for unprotected womenfolk. These parts ain't safe for a pretty thing like yourself. The other 2 riders spread out, flanking her wagon with practiced precision. One was tall and lean, sitting his horse with the easy confidence of a born saddle tramp. The other was younger, nervous energy, making his mount skitter sideways, but his hands were steady on his weapons. All 3 bore the look of men who'd grown comfortable with violence. They've done this before, Louisa realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. This is routine for them. Much obliged for your concern, she replied, proud that her voice remained steady. But I'm managing just fine on my own. Hatchet Harry's laugh was like gravel grinding in a mill. See, that's where you're wrong, Missy. A woman alone out here. Well, she might find herself in all sorts of unfortunate circumstances. Lucky for you, we know some fine gentleman who'd be more than happy to provide protection. Food, shelter, steady work. His voice dropped to a more sinister tone. Course, such generosity comes with certain expectations. The meaning was clear enough, and Louisa felt ice form in her stomach as her mind conjured images of the whispered stories she'd heard in Willow Springs, young women who vanished from frontier trails only to surface months later in mining camps far north, broken and hollow-eyed. Or worse, never surfaced at all. Not me, she thought fiercely, her father's stubborn determination flowing through her veins like liquid fire. I didn't survive losing Papa and fight for these papers just to become merchandise for vermin like you. Her fingers found the derringer's grip, just as the tall grass beside the road rustled with movement, too deliberate, too purposeful to be wind. A figure rose from the prairie like something born from the earth itself. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with fluid grace despite a pronounced limp favoring his right leg. His dark hair hung loose to his shoulders, and his weathered face bore the strong features of the Lakota people. But it was his eyes that made Hatchet Harry's horse suddenly rear cold, calculating, and filled with the kind of violence that made seasoned killers reconsider their choices. The Spencer rifle in his hands was aimed directly at Harry's chest. "Tokala," the tall rider breathed, and Louisa heard genuine fear in his voice. "Ghost Eagle." The Lakota warrior said nothing for a long moment, his dark gaze taking in the scene with predatory assessment. When he finally spoke, his English was precise, accented, but clear. 3 armed men, 1 woman. The spirit's whisper of cowardice on the wind. 3 Bear's daughter Tokala thought as his eyes briefly found Louisa's face. She had that same fire in her eyes before they took her. The memory of his friend's sister, barely 18 when she'd vanished from a trail, much like this one, sent familiar rage coursing through his veins. He'd tracked her for 2 months before finding her body in a shallow grave near the Canadian border, her small hands still bearing the rope burns from her captivity. Hatchet Harry straightened in his saddle, trying to reclaim authority. "This ain't your concern, Indian. Ride on, and we'll forget we saw you." Tokala's response was to step closer to Louisa's wagon, his limp more pronounced with each step, but his rifle never wavering. The old bullet wound in his thigh, a gift from a cavalry patrol 3 summers past, sent familiar fire up his leg, but he'd learned to channel pain into focus. When he reached her side, he did something completely unexpected. He leaned close and spoke in a voice pitched to carry to all 3 outlaws. "This woman carries the future of my clan." He declared his words, cutting through the sleet like a blade. "She is under the protection of the spirits. Harm her, and I will not kill you. I will hunt down everyone you love, and the crows will grow fat on their remains." Louisa's breath caught. The warrior's words were clearly meant for the outlaw's ears, but something in his tone suggested layers of meaning she couldn't yet fathom. She was quick-witted enough to recognize a ruse when she heard one, though, and her fear transformed into cautious hope. "He's giving me a chance," she realized. Playing their superstitions against them? Playing her part, she shrank back against the wagon's seat, letting genuine trembling shake her voice. "Please," she whispered loud enough for the outlaws to hear. "I didn't know. I was just trying to reach town." Tokala's hand settled on the wagon's side, close enough to her that she could feel warmth radiating from his body. Brave, he thought, noting how quickly she'd understood and adapted to his strategy. "Like a warrior, but smarter than most I've known." Aloud, he announced with the finality of carved stone, "She is mine. Any who touch what belongs to Ghost Eagle will learn why Lakota mothers frighten their children with my name." The young outlaw's horse danced nervously beneath him. "Harry," he hissed, "maybe we should shut your mouth." Harry snapped, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. The stories of Ghost Eagle were legend throughout the territory, a Lakota warrior who'd earned his name by appearing like smoke on battlefields, striking without warning, vanishing like mist. More importantly, he was known to keep his promises of vengeance with methodical, creative brutality. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. sleet continued falling, pattering against leather and cloth with increasing intensity, while horses stamped and snorted in the growing cold. Louisa could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge, could almost taste violence building in the air, like smoke from a distant fire. Her pulse hammered in her ears, but beneath the fear ran a strange exhilaration. For the first time since her father's death, she wasn't facing her troubles alone. Hatchet, Harry's hand drifted toward his sidearm. 1 rifle against 3, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Tokala's smile was winter itself. 1 shot is all I need for you. Your friends can explain to your woman why you came home in pieces. The tall outlaw's nerve broke first. Harry, this ain't worth it. We got quotas to fill, but not with this one. Not if she's spoken for by... He swallowed hard. By him. Louisa caught the significance of those words, quotas. These men weren't just random bandits. They were part of something larger, more organized. The trafficking ring she'd heard whispered about in settlements. Hatchet. Harry's eyes narrowed, but he was a man who'd survived this long by knowing when to fold a losing hand. This ain't over, he growled, backing his horse away from the wagon. Territory's got a long memory for those who interfere with business. So do I. Tokala replied softly, and the promise in those 3 words sent visible shudders through all 3 outlaws. But Harry's pride demanded one last gesture. His hand flashed toward his pistol iron clearing leather with practiced speed. He was faster than most men had any right to be. But Tokala was already moving, the Spencer rifle swinging up in roaring thunder across the prairie. The bullet took Harry's horse in the shoulder, sending the animal screaming and rearing. Harry pitched from the saddle, rolling in the mud as his mount bolted. The tall outlaw's rifle cracked in response, sending splinters flying from the wagon's side. Louisa ducked low, her heart hammering, as lead whistled overhead, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing off the bare trees like Judgment Day. Tokala was already moving again, his strong hand closing around Louisa's wrist with surprising gentleness despite the urgency. Now, he commanded, and pulled her from the wagon's seat, just as the young outlaw's pistol sent another bullet through the space where she'd been sitting. They ran for the cottonwoods, Tokala's limp making their progress uneven, but still swift. Each step sent fire through his old wound, but he'd learned long ago to push past pain when survival depended on it. Behind them, Hatchet Harry was shouting curses as he tried to catch his wounded horse, while his companions fired wild shots that split bark and scattered leaves like deadly rain. The Ash River ran high and cold beneath the trees, swollen with autumn rains and early snowmelt. The water was the color of pewter rushing past, with the urgent voice of winter approaching. Without hesitation, Tokala plunged into the icy water, pulling Louisa after him. The shock of cold drove breath from her lungs like a physical blow, numbing her legs instantly. But his strong arm around her waist kept her from going under, like jumping into liquid winter, she thought, as the current tugged at her heavy skirts. The cold was so intense, it felt like burning every nerve, screaming in protest. They waded to where the river curved, creating an undercut bank lined with exposed cottonwood roots. Tokala guided her into the shadowy space beneath the overhang, pressing her back against the muddy bank as rushing water concealed them from view. The smell of wet earth and rotting leaves filled her nostrils, and she could feel his body heat even through their soaked clothes. Stay quiet. He breathed against her ear, his voice barely audible above the river's murmur. They cannot track what the water washes away. Louisa nodded, trying to control her violent shivering. The cold was bone-deep numbing, but she forced herself to listen as hoofbeats thundered along the riverbank above them. Harsh voices called back and forth, growing more distant as the outlaws continued their search downstream. Each hoofbeat on the frozen ground above sounded like thunder in her ears, and she found herself holding her breath until her lungs burned. Long minutes passed before Tokala finally stirred, carefully peering out from their hiding place. His dark eyes scanned the riverbank, with the intensity of a hunter reading signs invisible to her. "They have gone," he announced quietly. "But they will return with more men." This was not random chance. They were watching the road as they waded back toward shore. Water streaming from their clothes and their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Louisa's initial shock began transforming into anger. The icy water had stripped away her fear, leaving behind a burning fury that seemed to warm her from within. What in blazes was that about? She demanded, wringing water from her skirts with sharp, angry movements. That whole performance with claiming me like some prize heifer? Tokala's dark eyes met hers steadily, and she saw something in them that might have been approval. Those men are part of a ring that takes young women from frontier trails. They sell them to mining camps in Canada or force them into marriages with men who pay well for unwilling brides. His voice carried bitter knowledge and something more personal. They attacked Lakota women 3 moons ago. My friend's sister was among them. I have been hunting them since I found her body. The personal pain in his voice struck her like a physical blow. Understanding dawned, followed by grudging appreciation. "So, you made them think I was already claimed? That I'd bring down tribal vengeance if they touched me? Ikax, they fear the reputation of Ghost Eagle more than they value one woman's price," he confirmed. It was, how do you say, a calculated risk. Louisa studied his weathered face, noting the intelligence behind those dark eyes, the careful way he observed his surroundings even now. There was something about this man that spoke to the practical part of her nature. He was competent, dangerous when necessary, but not cruel. Her father would have approved of him, she thought. Well, it worked. Though next time a little warning might be nice before you drag a person into your schemes. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. "Next time, I will send a formal invitation." Despite everything, the cold, the fear, the near-death experience, Louisa found herself almost smiling. There was something deeply reassuring about his dry humor in the face of danger. "Much obliged." She looked back toward the road where her wagon stood, abandoned, the horses cropping grass as if nothing had happened. "Think it's safe to retrieve my things?" Tokala considered this. His head tilted as he listened to sounds only he could interpret. The set of his shoulders, the way his fingers rested near his rifle. Everything about him spoke of a man who'd learned to survive in a world that showed no mercy to the careless. "For now, but we cannot stay on the main road. Hatchet Harry will gather reinforcements." He studied her with frank assessment. "Where were you traveling? What is so important that you risk winter travel alone?" Louisa retrieved the tin box from beneath the wagon seat, clutching it protectively against her chest. The metal was cold against her palms, but it represented everything her father had worked for, everything he died believing in. "Willow Springs. I have papers to file at the county office, homestead deed and water rights my father left me. Land by Prairie Rose Creek." Tokala's expression sharpened with interest. "Prairie Rose Creek. The spring that feeds 3 ranches. That's the one." Louisa's voice carried bitter knowledge of her own. "Which is why certain parties would prefer those papers never reach the courthouse." "Conrad Hale," Tokala said, and it wasn't a question. "You know him. I know his reputation. He has been buying up all land with reliable water sources. Men who refuse to sell often find themselves unlucky." Tokala's tone carried dark implications. "If you control Prairie Rose Creek, you control the water that keeps his cattle alive." The sleet was turning to proper frost, now crystalline formations that stuck to their wet clothes and turned the world white around them. Louisa shivered, but not entirely from cold. "Then, I'd better get those papers filed before something unfortunate happens to me too." That evening, they made camp in a sheltered grove. where an overhanging rock formation provided protection from the wind. Tokala had insisted they travel well off the main roads, following game trails and creek beds that would make them difficult to track. By the time they stopped, Louisa was bone-weary, but impressed by his woodcraft. He seemed to read the land like an open book, finding shelter and safety where she would have seen only wilderness. The fire he built was small and smokeless, positioned so the rock wall would disperse what little smoke there was. He worked with efficient, economical movements that spoke of long practice, and soon they had coffee boiling and salt pork sizzling in a battered pan. "Tell me about your father," Tokala said as they shared the simple meal. His question surprised her. She'd expected practical discussion about roots and dangers, not personal conversation. "He was a dreamer," she said after a moment, staring into the flames. "Came west after my mother died, looking for a place where a man could build something lasting. He wasn't a farmer by trade. He'd been a clerk in St. Louis, but he had this vision of creating a small ranch where families could prosper." She smiled at the memory. "He used to say the land called to him, told him secrets about where the water flowed and which soil would grow the best crops. A man who listened to the earth spirit." Tokala nodded approvingly. "The Lakota understand such dreams. What about you?" she asked, surprised by her own curiosity about this enigmatic man who'd appeared from nowhere to save her life. "How does a Lakota warrior come to speak English so well, to know so much about white man's law?" Tokala was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did speak, his voice carried old pain. "My mother was captured by soldiers when I was young, taken to a mission school where they tried to civilize us. Beat the Indian out of us, they said." His jaw tightened. "She died there, but not before she taught me that knowledge is a weapon. That understanding your enemy's language and customs can be the difference between survival and destruction." "I'm sorry," Louisa said softly. "That must have been terrible. It taught me that the world is not divided simply into good and evil, but into those who protect the innocent and those who prey upon them." He looked at her across the fire, and in his eyes she saw a depth of conviction that took her breath away. "Today you were innocent. Tomorrow perhaps you will be strong enough to protect others." Something in his tone made her heart skip a beat. Not romance, nothing so simple, but recognition. As if he saw something in her that she was only beginning to understand about herself. "He sees me as I could be," she realized. "Not as I am, but as I might become." 2 days of hard travel through increasingly hostile weather brought them to a sheltered valley, where the Ash River curved between stands of cottonwood and pine. The frost had intensified during their journey, turning the landscape into a crystalline wonderland that was beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. They'd been forced to take shelter twice in rocky overhangs, while the worst of the squalls passed, huddled together for warmth, while ice formed on their clothes and gear. Now, as they crested a low ridge, she could see smoke rising from the valley below. A cluster of lodges sat in the shelter of the trees, their buffalo hide walls glowing warm and golden in the gray afternoon light. The sight made her realize just how cold and exhausted she'd become. Her hands were numb despite her gloves, and her feet felt like blocks of ice in her boots. "My uncle's winter camp," Tokala explained, though his posture had grown more alert as they approached. 10 bears leads here when the harsh weather comes early." "Something wrong?" Louisa asked, noting the tension in his voice. "Perhaps. The horses are restless, and there are too few guards visible." He studied the camp with the intensity of a man who'd learned to read danger in the smallest details. "My people do not make mistakes about security. Something has happened." They descended into the valley, leading Louisa's wagon horses carefully down the treacherous slope. As they neared the camp, figures emerged from the largest lodge. An older man with iron-gray hair and a face carved by decades of prairie wind followed by a young woman whose dark eyes held both curiosity and caution. Uncle Tokala called out in English clearly for Louisa's benefit. "I bring a guest who has need of shelter." 10 bears approached them with the measured stride of a man accustomed to command. His weathered face showed no surprise at seeing a white woman in his nephew's company, though his dark eyes assessed her with frank interest. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented, but clear. "Ghost Eagle returns with more than he left with," the older man observed, though there was warmth beneath the formal words. "What storm brings a Wasakyu woman to our fire?" "Conrad Hale's storm," Tokala replied grimly. "She carries papers that threaten his water empire. His men tried to take her on the Copper Gulch Road." 10 Bear's expression darkened like clouds gathering before a tornado. "Hatchet Harry's work," among others. They spoke of quotas and northern shipping. Tokala's jaw tightened, and Louisa could see old fury kindling in his eyes. The trafficking ring grows bolder. They no longer hide their activities. The young woman stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Louisa with open curiosity. "I am Winema," she said in careful English. "You are welcome at our fire, sister, Louisa McKenna." She replied, touched by the girl's kindness, despite the obvious tension in the camp. "I'm grateful for your hospitality." 10 Bears gestured toward the lodge. "Come. The wind carries frost, and we have much to discuss. There have been developments since you left." Inside the spacious lodge, warmth enveloped them like a blessing. A fire crackled in the center, its smoke rising through the opening above, while the buffalo hide walls seemed to glow with stored heat. Thick robes covered the ground, and painted parfleches held the family's possessions. It was surprisingly comfortable, far removed from the crude stereotypes Louisa had grown up hearing about Indian dwellings. As Winema ladled hot stew into wooden bowls, the rich smell of meat and roots making Louisa's stomach growl with sudden hunger. 10 Bears listened with growing concern as she explained her situation. She told them about her father's death, the papers he'd left her, and her determination to file them before Conrad Hale could find a way to steal her inheritance. Prairie Rose Creek. 10 Bears mused when she finished, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that steamed in the cold air. "The spring that feeds the heart of the land. Your father was wise to claim it, but wisdom does not protect against bullets." "That's why I need to get to the courthouse as quickly as possible," Louisa said. "Once the papers are officially filed, you think Hale respects law." 10 Bears interrupted not unkindly. His voice carried the weariness of a man who'd seen too much of white man's justice. "He owns the sheriff in 3 counties and judges in 2 more. Paper means nothing to a man who writes his own rules." Louisa felt her heart sink. The careful hope she'd been nursing since her father's death began to crumble. "Then what's the point, if he's going to take my land anyway?" "I did not say he would succeed," 10 Bears corrected gently. "Only that legal papers alone will not stop him. You need allies and proof of his crimes that even bought judges cannot ignore." Before Louisa could respond, then the lodge flap opened, and 3 more people entered, shaking frost from their coats. The first was clearly a white man, middle-aged, with the kind of soft hands that spoke of education rather than manual labor. His black medical bag and professional manner identified him as a doctor even before 10 Bears made introductions. "Dr. Edwin Price," the older man said, extending his hand. "I minister to whoever needs healing regardless of the color of their skin. A policy that makes me unpopular in certain circles, but keeps my conscience clear." The second was clearly Lakota, younger than Tokala, but carrying himself with similar confidence. His keen eyes missed nothing as they swept over Louisa, and she noticed the way his hand never strayed far from his rifle. "The Hawkeye," Tokala said simply. "My cousin, the best marksman between here and the Yellowstone." But it was the third newcomer who captured Louisa's attention. A white woman, probably in her late 20s, with the kind of practical clothing and no-nonsense manner that spoke of frontier teaching. There was something about the way she moved, though a subtle tension in her shoulders, a careful way of positioning herself near the lodge entrance, that suggested she carried burdens beyond a simple schoolmarm's concerns. Beatrice Lark. She introduced herself, settling onto a buffalo robe with practiced ease. I run the schoolhouse in Willow Springs. She paused, her fingers unconsciously tracing patterns on her coat sleeve. When I'm not documenting certain irregularities in local land transactions. Dr. Price was examining a young Lakota man's bandaged arm when he looked up with a grim expression. Speaking of irregularities, I pulled this from 2 horses yesterday. He held up a flattened bullet with his tweezers, said the metal deformed, but still clearly marked. .44 caliber with an interesting marking. Then Louisa peered at the bullet and saw what looked like an H carved into the base. The Hatchet Harry's calling card. Tokala said grimly, his voice carrying old hatred. He marks his bullets so his victims know who killed them. A signature of pride in his cruelty. 2 horses was lucky. Dr. Price continued his professional calm, barely concealing his anger. The bullet lodged in bone rather than tearing through vital organs. But he was found near Willow Springs, beaten half to death. Said he was driving cattle for a rancher when he stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see. What kind of something? Louisa asked, though she suspected she already knew. Young women in chains being loaded into wagons headed north. When 2 horses tried to ride away, they shot him for sport and left him for dead. Dr. Price's voice grew harder. They thought they'd killed him, but the boy's tough as leather. He crawled 3 miles before a Lakota hunting party found him. Beatrice's hands tightened around her cup, and Louisa noticed they were trembling slightly. The trafficking, she said quietly, her voice carrying an odd weight. It's not just rumors anymore, is it? It never was just rumors. 10 Bears replied gravely. 3 Lakota women vanished near Hale's lands last summer. Their families still mourn. And one of them was my friend's sister Tokala, thought the familiar rage building in his chest. Little singing bird who laughed like water over stones and made the best beadwork in the tribe. They found her body 2 months later, used up and discarded like refuse. The lodge fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Outside, the wind continued to howl, driving frost against the buffalo hide walls with the persistence of winter itself. But inside, plans were taking shape, dangerous plans that would test all their courage in the days to come. Hawkeye had been quiet through most of this discussion, but now he leaned forward. Why should we help her? He asked bluntly, his English only slightly accented. She is Wasiku. Her people have brought us nothing but sorrow. Because, 10 Bears said with quiet authority, injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere. If we allow evil to flourish because we think it does not touch us, we become part of that evil. Besides, Dr. Price added practically, Hale's water empire threatens everyone. If he controls Prairie Rose Creek, he controls the lifeblood of this entire region. Beatrice looked up from her cup, and Louisa caught something strange in her expression, a flicker of pain quickly suppressed. I've been gathering evidence for months, she said quietly. Documents, witness statements, proof of land fraud, and worse. But I need help getting it to someone who can act on it. What kind of evidence? Tokala asked. Forged deeds, falsified bank records, testimony from victims who survived. Beatrice's voice grew stronger as she spoke. And something else, evidence of where the trafficking money goes, who profits from it. Louisa felt a surge of hope. That could bring down his entire operation, if we can get it to the right people. Beatrice agreed. and if we can stay alive long enough to testify. The morning brought clear skies and bitter cold, the kind of crystalline winter day that turned breath to vapor and made every sound carry for miles. As they prepared for the journey to Willow Springs, Beatrice made an unusual request. "I need to stop by my cabin first," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "There are documents I've been gathering, evidence that might prove useful." Her cabin was a modest structure built into a hillside, cleverly concealed from casual observation. But what struck Louisa as odd was how well appointed it was for a frontier teacher's salary: fine furniture, expensive books, even what looked like a small safe built into the wall. "Teaching pays better than expected out here," Louisa observed casually. Beatrice's laugh was forced, and she turned away quickly. "I had some family support when I first came west, an inheritance from my father." Her voice caught slightly on the last words, and she busied herself gathering papers from the safe. But Louisa noticed something else, the way Beatrice's hand shook as she opened the safe, revealing not just documents, but also a small portrait. The face in the painting was that of a distinguished older man, with silver hair and cold, pale eyes. For just an instant before Beatrice quickly concealed it, Louisa glimpsed something familiar about those features. Something that made her stomach clench with sudden unease. "I've seen those eyes before," she thought. But where? As Beatrice gathered her papers, her movements became increasingly agitated. Finally, she sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. "The lies, the pretending, the constant fear that he'll discover what I'm really doing." "Who?" Louisa asked gently, though she was beginning to suspect. "My father," Beatrice said without looking up. "Conrad Hale." The revelation hit Louisa like a physical blow. "You're his daughter." "Was his daughter," Beatrice corrected bitterly, "until I learned what kind of monster I was related to. Until I saw what he did to those women, how he destroyed anyone who stood in his way." She looked up, and Louisa saw tears streaming down her face. "I've been fighting him for 3 years, gathering evidence, trying to find someone with the courage to stand against him. Why didn't you tell us before?" "Because I knew you'd never trust me. Would you have believed anything I said if you'd known who my father was?" Beatrice's voice broke. "He raised me to be like him, cold, calculating, ruthless, in pursuit of power. It took me years to understand that strength doesn't have to mean cruelty." Tokala, who had been silent through this exchange, finally spoke. "You chose your own path. That takes more courage than most possess. Does it?" Beatrice's laugh was bitter. "Or am I just a coward who ran away when things got difficult? A coward would not have spent 3 years gathering evidence against her own father," Ten Bears observed. "A coward would not risk everything to help strangers." The journey to Willow Springs took them through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous as they approached the town. The frost had turned the roads into ribbons of ice, and more than once they had to dismount and lead the horses across particularly dangerous sections. But it was the town itself that provided the greatest shock. Where they'd expected normal frontier bustle, they found an atmosphere of barely contained fear. People moved quickly along the boardwalks, their eyes downcast, avoiding contact with the small groups of armed men who seemed to patrol every corner. "To Hale's men," Tokala observed quietly, noting the matching brands on their horses. "The town is under occupation. It's gotten worse." Beatrice whispered, her face pale, as she recognized several of the gunmen. "He's bringing in more men from outside. This isn't just about intimidation anymore. He's preparing for war." They made their way toward the courthouse, a substantial brick building that dominated the town square. But as they drew closer, Louisa's heart sank. A large sign hung from the main entrance. County clerk's office temporarily closed by order of Deputy Eric Sloan. Convenient, Beatrice muttered, but Louisa noticed she'd gone pale, her hands trembling as she stared at the courthouse. How much do you want to bet Sloan is in my father's pocket? Before anyone could comment, a commotion erupted from the alley beside the courthouse. A young woman's scream cut through the afternoon air, followed by harsh male laughter and the sound of a struggle. Tokala was moving before Louisa could even process what was happening, his limp barely slowing him as he sprinted toward the alley. She followed, her heart hammering with adrenaline and anger. The scene that greeted them was exactly what she'd feared. 3 rough-looking men had cornered a girl who couldn't have been more than 16, her torn dress and terror-filled eyes, telling the story without words. One of the men, stocky and familiar, was trying to force her toward a group of saddled horses. Hatchet Harry had found easier prey than Louisa McKenna. Let her go. Tokala commanded, his rifle appearing in his hands with practiced speed. Harry looked up with genuine surprise, then broke into a cruel grin. Well, looky here. The Ghost Eagle come to play hero again. He tightened his grip on the struggling girl, and Louisa could see finger-shaped bruises already forming on her thin arms. This here's a private business transaction, Indian. Walk away and nobody gets hurt. The only transaction happening here, Louisa said, stepping into view with her derringer drawn, is you releasing that girl and riding out of town. But the standoff was broken by the arrival of more men, 5 hard-looking individuals wearing deputy badges, but carrying themselves like hired guns. Their leader was a tall, thin man with cold eyes and a carefully waxed mustache, Deputy Eric Sloan. He announced, though, his attention was focused entirely on Tokala's rifle. I'll ask you to lower that weapon. You're interfering with official business. It was then that Louisa noticed Beatrice's reaction. The school teacher had gone rigid, her face draining of color as she stared at the deputy. Her hands were trembling, and she took an involuntary step backward as if confronting a nightmare made flesh. Official business, Beatrice demanded, but her voice was strained, almost desperate. Since when is kidnapping official business? Sloane's cold gaze fixed on her with unmistakable recognition, and his thin lips curved in a smile that had nothing to do with humor. Miss Lark, isn't it? The way he said her name with a slight hesitation, as if it weren't her real one, made Louisa's blood run cold. Perhaps you should mind your own affairs. Certain parties have taken an interest in your activities. The threat was clear, but it was something else in his tone that made Louisa's mind race with terrible possibilities. He knows, she realized. He knows exactly who she is. Just when the situation seemed hopeless, salvation arrived from an unexpected quarter. The sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of Circuit Judge Morrison, early from his territorial rounds and accompanied by a small escort of territorial marshals. No, what's the meaning of this? Judge Morrison demanded, his authoritative voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Deputy Sloan, explain why I find armed men threatening civilians in front of my courthouse. At the courthouse, Judge Morrison's chambers became the arena where legal warfare would be waged. The spacious room was furnished with heavy oak furniture that spoke of permanence and authority, its tall windows letting in the weak winter sunlight that painted everything in shades of amber and gold. As they settled around his massive desk, Louisa felt the weight of her father's tin box like a lifeline to everything she'd lost and everything she hoped to regain. Miss McKenna. Judge Morrison began adjusting his spectacles as he studied the group before him with evident interest. I understand you have papers to file? Louisa opened the tin box with trembling fingers, revealing the carefully preserved documents within. The papers seemed fragile as autumn leaves, but they represented everything her father had worked for, everything he died believing in. My father's homestead deed and water rights for land along Prairie Rose Creek, Your Honor. He died 3 months ago, and the inheritance passes to me. The judge examined the papers with practiced efficiency, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "These appear to be in order," he said finally. "Standard homestead claim, properly witnessed and notarized. The water rights are particularly comprehensive. Your father was prescient in securing those." He saw this coming, Louisa realized with a surge of pride and sadness. Papa knew someone would try to steal the water, so he made sure the papers were ironclad. But before the hearing could continue, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the tall windows, they could see Deputy Sloan arguing with someone in the square below. The conversation appeared heated with much gesturing toward the courthouse and obvious agitation on both sides. "Your Honor." A young clerk entered looking nervous and apologetic. "There's a gentleman here who insists on speaking with you immediately. Says it's a matter of urgent legal business." Morrison frowned, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Send him away. I'm conducting a hearing. He says he's Conrad Hale, sir, and he has documentation that pertains to this case." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Louisa felt her stomach clench with dread, while Tokala's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle. But most telling was Beatrice's reaction. She had gone white as parchment, her hands gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles showed bone. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and for a moment Louisa thought she might faint. She's terrified, Louisa realized. Not just nervous, genuinely afraid of seeing him again. "Not very well," Morrison said after a moment's consideration. "Show him in. But this hearing will continue." Conrad Hale entered the chambers with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. He was tall and distinguished with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from wealth and power. But there was something predatory in his pale eyes that spoke of a man who'd grown comfortable with violence, and his smile held all the warmth of a winter grave. As he approached the judge's desk, his gaze swept over the assembled group with calculating assessment. When his eyes reached Beatrice, something complex flickered there. Recognition, disappointment, and what might have been paternal concern twisted into something darker and more possessive. "He knows exactly what she's been doing," Louisa realized with growing horror. "This whole time he's known." "Your Honor," Hale said with practiced deference, his voice carrying unmistakable authority beneath its respectful tone. "I apologize for the interruption, but there are facts pertaining to this case that you should be aware of." He placed a leather portfolio on Morrison's desk, and as he did so, Louisa noticed something that made her blood run cold. The way he moved a particular gesture when opening documents was almost identical to something she'd seen Beatrice do. The resemblance was subtle, but unmistakable once noticed. Father and daughter, she thought. No matter how much she hates him, she can't escape being his blood. "Miss McKenna's father died owing substantial debts to my bank." Hale continued smoothly, his pale eyes never leaving Beatrice's face. "According to territorial law, those debts transfer to his estate." He produced a promissory note with her father's signature, the paper looking official and properly executed. $1,500 borrowed against the homestead as collateral. With accumulated interest, the current amount due is over $2,000. Louisa felt the blood drain from her face as her carefully nurtured hopes began to crumble. "That's impossible. My father was always careful with money. I'm afraid the records speak for themselves." Hale interrupted, but Louisa noticed his eyes kept drifting to Beatrice, who sat frozen in her chair like a rabbit caught in a snare. There was something in his gaze, not just recognition, but ownership. The look of a man who considered his daughter his property no matter how far she ran or how much she fought against him. Tokala was studying the documents with surprising intensity, his dark eyes moving over the papers with the focus of a hunter tracking prey. "Your Honor, may I examine these papers?" Morrison nodded, passing the documents across the desk. As Tokala studied them, his expression began to sharpen with something that might have been satisfaction. "The signature," he said, after several minutes of careful examination. It appears to have been written with a steel pen. What does that matter? Hale asked impatiently, but there was the slightest edge to his voice, now the first crack in his confident facade. Miss McKenna, what kind of pen did your father use for important documents? Louisa thought back, remembering her father at his small desk in their cabin, carefully writing by lamplight. A quill pen, she replied, understanding dawning like sunrise. He always said steel pens were unreliable on the frontier, too easily damaged. He preferred goose quills for anything important. Tokala smiled grimly, holding up the homestead papers for comparison. The signature on your father's homestead claim was written with a quill pen. The ink is slightly different as well, iron gall ink for the homestead, commercial ink for this promissory note. Judge Morrison re-examined both documents more carefully, his expression growing increasingly stern. But it was Beatrice who provided the final devastating observation. She rose slowly from her chair, her face a mask of pain and resolve, years of accumulated anguish finally finding voice. The handwriting, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the silent chamber. The promissory note. I know that handwriting. She looked directly at Hale, and Louisa saw something break in her expression and the last chains of filial loyalty snapping under the weight of moral conviction. You always were better at intimidation than forgery, Father. The word fell into the room like a thunderbolt, illuminating everything in a single brilliant flash. The resemblance, the fear, the careful way she'd positioned herself as far from him as possible. It all made terrible sense now. Beatrice Lark was Beatrice Hale Conrad's own daughter, working against him from the inside. The revelation sent shockwaves through the chamber. Hale's composed facade cracked like ice under pressure, revealing something cold and vicious underneath. His pale eyes fixed on his daughter with a mixture of disappointment and rage that made Louisa's skin crawl. Beatrice, he said, his voice carrying complex layers of disappointment and barely controlled fury. I had hoped you would come to your senses, that you would remember your loyalty to family. I did come to my senses, she replied, tears streaming down her face, but her voice growing stronger with each word. That's why I've been documenting your crimes for the past 3 years. That's why I left you and took Mother's maiden name. 3 years, Louisa thought with growing admiration. She's been fighting him for 3 years right under his nose. Your mother, Hale said softly, his voice taking on a more dangerous tone, died of consumption. But she also died of shame, knowing what her daughter became. She died of shame, knowing what her husband became. Beatrice shot back, her composure finally cracking completely. A trafficker. A murderer. A man who sells women like cattle and destroys anyone who stands in his way. She begged me on her deathbed to be better than you, and I've tried. God help me, I've tried. The pain in her voice was raw and devastating, years of accumulated guilt and determination pouring out in a flood of words. Louisa found herself blinking back tears at the sheer courage it must have taken to live this double life, to smile and pretend loyalty, while secretly gathering evidence against her own father. Judge Morrison had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm and fascination. Mr. Hale, he said with icy formality, these documents appear to be forgeries of the most clumsy sort. Miss McKenna's filing is accepted and recorded as of this moment. But even as legal victory was achieved, everyone in the room knew the real battle was just beginning. Conrad Hale was not a man to accept defeat gracefully, and the look in his pale eyes promised that legal setbacks would not stop him from getting what he wanted. This isn't over, he said quietly, his gaze moving from Beatrice to Louisa and back again. Not by a long shot. The journey back toward Ten Bears Camp was tense, with the knowledge that Conrad Hale would not accept defeat gracefully. As they rode through the gathering dusk, Beatrice finally opened up about her past, her voice hollow with years of accumulated pain. I've been fighting him for 3 years, she said quietly, her hands trembling on the reins. ever since I discovered what he was really doing. The land acquisitions were just the surface. Underneath was something far worse. The trafficking, Louisa said. Beatrice nodded, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. Young women taken from frontier trails, sold to mining camps in Canada, or forced into marriages with men who paid well for unwilling brides. When I confronted him about it, when I begged him to stop, he said it was necessary for building his empire, that the weak existed to serve the strong. How did you escape? Tokala asked, his voice gentle with understanding. I didn't, Beatrice replied with bitter irony, her laugh carrying no humor at all. I pretended to accept his explanations while secretly gathering evidence. I became the perfect daughter, dutiful, supportive, asking no difficult questions. He thinks I'm still his loyal child, just playing at being a schoolteacher to amuse myself. He has no idea how much I know, how much I've documented. The perfect spy, Louisa thought, hidden in plain sight by his own arrogance. Every document I've stolen, every witness I've interviewed, every piece of evidence I've gathered, it's all been leading to this moment. Beatrice continued. The moment when I finally have enough proof to destroy him completely. And now, Louisa asked, now he knows I've betrayed him. Beatrice's voice broke slightly. Did you see his face in there? He knows exactly what I've been doing, probably has for months. I'm as good as dead. But her deception was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. The moon was rising when they reached the valley, but instead of the warm welcome they'd expected, they found chaos. Smoke rose from scattered areas of the camp, and people moved with the urgent purpose of those preparing for war. Women loaded supplies into travois, while men checked weapons and counted ammunition. 10 bears met them at the valley's edge, his weathered face grim with news that made Louisa's blood run cold. They took Walter Pike. He announced without preamble, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who delivered too much bad news. Hale's men seized him from his farm this afternoon. His wife sent word they threatened to kill his family unless he revealed your plans. The betrayal hit Louisa like a physical blow, but she couldn't bring herself to feel real anger toward Walter. She'd seen the desperation in his eyes, the weight of debt and responsibility that crushed a man's spirit until he'd do anything to protect his family. What did he tell them? Tokala asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Everything. Our location, our numbers, the fact that Judge Morrison ruled in your favor. 10 Bear's expression was carved from stone. Hale's riders were seen moving toward the canyon passes 2 hours ago. They mean to trap us here. But worse news was yet to come. As they prepared the camp's defenses, a rider approached under a white flag, his horse lathered with sweat and his face pale with fear. It was one of Hale's men, bearing a message that chilled everyone who heard it. Mr. Hale offers terms. The messenger announced, his voice shaking slightly. Miss McKenna surrenders herself and her water rights, and he'll let the rest of you live. Refuse, and he burns the valley with everyone in it. You have until dawn to decide. The ultimatum hung in the cold night air like a death sentence. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a valley with limited escape routes. Women and children huddled in the lodges, while warriors checked their weapons with grim determination. But it was Dr. Price who provided the insight that would change everything. The mine, he said suddenly, interrupting the council of war. Hale's operation at Black Mesa, it depends on water from Prairie Rose Creek for the ore processing, doesn't it? Beatrice looked up from where she'd been staring into the fire. Her eyes red from crying, but her voice steady. Yes, they built a flume system to channel water from the creek to the crushing mills. Without it, the whole operation shuts down. Because, Louisa said, feeling a surge of fierce determination, if I control the water rights, I can cut off his supply. Legal or not, he can't operate without water. Tokala's eyes brightened with understanding. You want to destroy the flume? Well, better than destroying it. Louisa said, her mind racing with possibilities. We redirect the water, show everyone in the territory that Conrad Hale's empire depends on stolen resources. Let him explain to his investors why his mine suddenly went dry. It was a desperate plan, but it had the virtue of turning their legal victory into immediate action. More importantly, it would force Hale to come to them on ground of their choosing, rather than letting him dictate the terms of engagement. It's suicide, Hawkeye observed bluntly. The mine is heavily guarded and will be completely exposed while working on the flume. And maybe 10 bears agreed. But sometimes the only way to win is to make the enemy fight on your terms instead of his. The approach to Black Mesa took them through terrain that seemed designed for nightmares, twisted red rock formations that looked like sleeping giants in the moonlight, narrow passages where a single defender could hold off an army, and sheer drops that promised certain death to anyone unlucky enough to fall. The very landscape seemed hostile, as if the earth itself were warning them away from their destination. They reached the mine complex just before dawn, finding it less defended than expected. The great machinery rumbled continuously, processing ore, with the help of water diverted from Prairie Rose Creek through an elaborate wooden flume system that snaked along the canyon wall like a wooden river. Most of his forces are surrounding the valley, Beatrice whispered, studying the mine through Tokala's spyglass. He's left only a skeleton crew here because he doesn't expect us to attack. Arrogant, Louisa thought. He's so sure of his power that he can't imagine us striking back. The Black Mesa mine was an impressive sight, a sprawling complex of buildings, machinery, and processing equipment carved into the side of a red rock formation. Steam rose from the crushing mills where ore was processed around the clock, and the constant rumble of machinery echoed across the canyon like industrial thunder. Most importantly, Louisa could see the wooden flume that carried water from Prairie Rose Creek to the mine, a masterpiece of frontier engineering that snaked along the canyon wall for nearly a mile before emptying into the processing facility's holding tanks. Whatever Herbie, Tokala pointed to where the flume crossed a narrow ravine on wooden supports 30 feet above the canyon floor. If we cut it there, the water will flow back to its natural course. It would be dangerous work completely exposed while making the modifications with only a precarious maintenance ladder for access. Worse, they'd be visible from multiple points in the mine complex, making discovery almost inevitable. I'll do it, Louisa said firmly. No, Tokala replied immediately. I am the warrior here. You're wounded and you're needed to coordinate the attack. She interrupted. Besides, it's my water rights they're stealing, my responsibility. As the eastern sky began to pale with approaching dawn, they had no choice but to begin. Louisa climbed the ladder with tools strapped to her back, her heart hammering with fear and determination. Each rung seemed to take forever, and the drop below grew more terrifying with every step. Below, Tokala and the others took defensive positions among the rocks, ready to provide cover. The flume was constructed of heavy timber planks sealed with tar, designed to carry thousands of gallons of water each hour. She could feel the structure vibrating under the constant flow, hear the rush of water that would soon be flowing free again. She was halfway through cutting the first support beam when the shooting started. Muzzle flashes erupted from the mine buildings as guards realized what was happening. Bullets whined off the wooden flume and sparked against the rock face around her, forcing her to press herself flat against the structure while lead whistled overhead like angry wasps. Don't think about the bullets, she told herself, forcing her hands to remain steady on the saw. Just cut through this beam, one stroke at a time. The saw bit deeper into the timber with each stroke, sending wood chips spinning into the void below. Water began to seep through the growing crack, then pour, then gush as the wooden planks gave way under the tremendous pressure. But just as triumph seemed within reach, disaster struck. A bullet splintered the ladder rung below her feet, and suddenly she was falling nothing but 30 feet of empty air between her and certain death on the rocks below. This is how I die, she thought with strange clarity. Like Papa always said, I would stubborn to the end. Then Tokala's strong hands caught her wrist just as she cleared the ladder, his injured legs screaming in protest as he took her full weight. For a terrifying moment, they both teetered on the edge of the platform, gravity pulling them toward a destruction while his grip began to slip on the wet wood. He's going to die trying to save me, she realized with horror. We're both going to fall. Hold on. He grunted through gritted teeth, his face contorted with pain and effort. But Louisa managed to grab the broken ladder with her free hand, taking some of her weight off his straining arms. Together, they hauled her back onto the platform just as the damaged flume gave way completely. The torrent that resulted was spectacular, thousands of gallons cascading into the ravine below in a thunderous waterfall that sent spray flying in all directions. The sound was like the end of the world, drowning out even the gunfire, as Prairie Rose Creek reclaimed its natural course. The effect on the mine was immediate and devastating. Processing mills ground to a halt as their water supply dwindled to a trickle, while steam vented from overheated equipment that had been designed to run with constant cooling. Shouts of alarm echoed from the mine buildings as workers realized their operation was shutting down. But their triumph was short-lived. As they climbed down from the platform, they saw Conrad Hale himself approaching with fresh reinforcements, at least 20 armed men on horseback, their faces hard with the promise of violence. And in their midst, bound and beaten, was Walter Pike. The real battle was about to begin. Hale's voice carried clearly across the canyon as his men took positions among the mine buildings, their rifles glinting in the growing daylight. Miss McKenna, your little act of sabotage has cost me a considerable sum of money. I think it's time we discuss terms for your surrender. The standoff that followed was unlike anything in Louisa's experience. Conrad Hale positioned his men among the mine buildings, while Tokala and the Lakota warriors held defensive positions in the rocks below. She found herself caught in the middle with nowhere to run, and precious little cover the sound of dripping water from the broken flume marking time like a funeral drum. You've caused me considerable inconvenience, Hale said, stepping closer with his pistol drawn, his pale eyes reflecting the cold light of dawn. My investors are not patient men, and disruptions to our operation cost money I can ill afford to lose. Up close, Louisa could see the family resemblance to Beatrice. More clearly, the same strong jaw, the same intelligent eyes. But where Beatrice's features had been softened by compassion and conscience, Hale's face was hard with years of ruthless ambition. Then perhaps you should have thought of that before trying to steal my land, Louisa replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, despite the terror clawing at her chest. Hale's cold smile never wavered, but she caught something else in his expression, a flicker of what might have been respect. You're stronger than I expected. Your father raised you well, I'll give him that. But strength without wisdom is just stubbornness, and stubborn people tend to die young on the frontier. He's trying to unnerve me, she realized, trying to make me doubt myself. Strength with conscience, she corrected. Something you wouldn't understand. Walter Pike chose that moment to make his desperate play. Breaking free from his captors with a sudden burst of energy born from desperation, he sprinted toward the mine's powder magazine, his legs pumping despite the beating he'd obviously taken. Walter, no, Louisa cried, realizing his intention. Tell my family I paid the debt. He shouted back, disappearing into the explosive store with a torch clutched in his hand. Tell them I finally did something right. The explosion that followed was tremendous, a thunderous blast that shook the entire canyon and sent debris raining down like hail. The shock wave knocked everyone to the ground, and for several moments the only sound was the ringing in their ears and the rumble of falling stone. But Walter's sacrifice did more than create chaos. The blast had weakened critical support structures throughout the mine, and now a deadly chain reaction began. Support timbers cracked and gave way, sending tons of rock cascading down the canyon walls. Gas lines ruptured, filling the air with deadly fumes that made breathing difficult. Most critically, the explosion had damaged the mine's drainage system, and water from the redirected creek began flooding the lower levels. The whole place is coming apart, Louisa thought as she picked herself up from the ground. Walter didn't just create a diversion, he started an avalanche. The whole place is coming apart, Dr. Price shouted over the rumbling of collapsing structures, voicing her own thoughts. In the chaos that followed, Tokala's rifle cracked twice in rapid succession, dropping 2 of Hale's men who had been stunned by the explosion. Hawkeye's shots from above created enough confusion for the other Lakota warriors to advance on the remaining gunmen. But it was the confrontation between Conrad Hale and his daughter that commanded Louisa's horrified attention. Beatrice had moved to a position where she could see her father clearly, her rifle trained on his chest, with hands that no longer trembled. "It's over, Father." She called out her voice, carrying years of accumulated pain and a resolve as hard as winter iron. "Your empire is crumbling around you, just like everything else you've ever built." Hale turned to face his daughter, and for a moment, his mask of cold control slipped to reveal something almost human. A flash of genuine hurt that he couldn't quite suppress. "After everything I gave you," he said, his voice carrying a complex mix of pain and rage. "After everything I taught you about strength and power, this is how you repay me. You taught me that might makes right." Beatrice replied, tears streaming down her face, but her aim never wavering. "You taught me that the weak exist to serve the strong. But you forgot to teach me that strength without mercy isn't strength at all, it's just brutality." This is killing her, Louisa realized. No matter what he's done, he's still her father. The mine continued its collapse around them. But father and daughter seemed locked in their own private world of pain and betrayal. "I loved you," Hale said quietly. For the first time, his voice carried genuine emotion. "Everything I did was to build something lasting for you to inherit. You built nothing but misery," Beatrice sobbed. "And I'd rather die than inherit 1 penny of blood money." Hale's response was swift and vicious, not a shot at Beatrice, but at Louisa herself and the woman whose water rights had started it all. His pistol swung toward her with practiced speed, his finger already tightening on the trigger. The bullet would have taken her in the chest if Tokala hadn't thrown himself between them, his body twisting as the impact spun him around and sent him crashing against a pile of ore. Blood immediately began soaking through his shirt, spreading across the fabric like spilled wine. "No," Louisa cried, dropping to his side without thought for her own safety. The wound was high in the chest, serious, but not immediately fatal if she could stop the bleeding. "You fool, why did you—" "Because—" he gasped through gritted teeth, his dark eyes finding hers. "Some things are worth dying for." "He loves me," she realized with a shock that cut through her fear. "This man I barely know is willing to die for me." Hale's desperate shot had been his last act of defiance. Before he could fire again, the mine's instability reached a critical point. A massive section of the canyon wall gave way, sending an avalanche of rock and debris crashing down toward the lower levels where most of his men were positioned. But Conrad Hale was not finished. Even as his empire collapsed around him, he reached for a detonator connected to charges he'd placed throughout the complex as insurance against exactly this kind of disaster. "If I can't have it," he snarled, his civilized mask finally falling away completely to reveal the savage underneath, "then no one will. This entire canyon will be your tomb." He's going to kill us all, Louisa thought with crystalline clarity. He'd rather destroy everything than admit defeat. The final confrontation was not the clean, heroic battle Louisa had imagined. Instead, it was desperate and brutal, a fight for survival among collapsing structures and deadly debris with death lurking in every shadow. Tokala, despite his wound, managed to tackle Hale just as the man's finger found the detonator switch. They rolled across the unstable ground, each trying to gain advantage, while the mine continued its death throes around them. Hale was older, but desperate, his strength fueled by a lifetime of getting his way through violence. Tokala was wounded, but driven by the need to protect those he'd come to love. They're going to kill each other, Louisa thought as she watched them struggle. And we're all going to die in this collapsing mine. The struggle carried them dangerously close to the edge of a newly formed chasm, where the canyon floor had collapsed, creating a pit that seemed to drop into the very heart of the earth. Loose rock crumbled beneath their feet as they grappled for control of the detonator, each man knowing that a single misstep would mean certain death. You should have stayed on your reservation. Hale gasped, his hands finding Tokala's throat. Should have minded your own business instead of playing hero for white trash and their stolen land. But Tokala's response was to drive his elbow into Hale's wounded shoulder, causing the man to scream and loosen his grip. In that moment of weakness, the Lakota warrior managed to tear the detonator from Hale's grasp and hurl it into the chasm below. The device exploded harmlessly in the depths, its charges too far away to cause further structural damage to the areas where they sheltered. But the effort had cost Tokala dearly. Blood was flowing freely from his chest wound, and his face was pale with shock and blood loss. He's dying, Louisa realized with a stab of pure terror. He's bleeding to death while I watch. Conrad Hale, realizing his final gambit had failed, made one last desperate attempt to take his enemies with him. Drawing a concealed knife from his boot, he lunged at the wounded Tokala with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. But Beatrice's rifle spoke with final authority. The bullet took her father in the chest, spinning him around and sending him tumbling toward the edge of the chasm. The sound of the shot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, followed by a silence that seemed to stretch for eternity. For a moment, Conrad Hale hung suspended over the abyss, his pale eyes wide with the first real fear Louisa had ever seen in them. His fingers scrabbled for purchase on the crumbling rock, and for one terrible instant, he looked not like a monster, but like a frightened old man facing his own mortality. "Beatrice," he whispered, and there was something almost like love in his voice. "My daughter." Then his grip failed, and he fell into the darkness below his scream, echoing off the canyon walls until it was swallowed by the depths. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of settling debris and the distant rumble of water finding its new course. Beatrice stood frozen, staring at the spot where her father had disappeared, tears streaming down her face. The rifle slipped from her nerveless fingers to clatter on the stone. "It's over," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the settling debris. "It's finally over." No, Louisa thought as she pressed her hands against Tokala's wound, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. It's not over until everyone who deserves to live gets to go home. The aftermath brought both relief and desperate urgency. Marshal Crawford arrived with territorial agents who had been tracking Hale's network for months, but their priority was getting the wounded to safety before the rest of the mine collapsed. Dr. Price worked frantically to stabilize Tokala's wound, while arrangements were made to transport him to Fort Laramie's hospital. The bullet had punctured his lung, but missed major blood vessels. He would live, though recovery would be long and difficult. "The lung is punctured, but not collapsed," Dr. Price explained as they prepared the travois. "He's lost blood, but he's strong. If we can get him proper medical attention quickly, he should make a full recovery." As they prepared to leave the ruins of Hale's empire, Beatrice made a decision that surprised everyone. "I'm going with you," she announced, her voice hollow but determined. "There's nothing left for me here and those women who were rescued from the trafficking ring. They'll need someone who understands what they've been through." She's found her purpose, Louisa realized. In destroying her father's empire, she's discovered who she really wants to be. The evidence they found at Black Mesa would dismantle the entire trafficking operation, freeing dozens of women and bringing justice to their captors. Conrad Hale's network stretched across 3 territories, but without its central figure, it began to collapse like a house of cards. 3 weeks later, The morning sun painted the walls of Fort Laramie's hospital ward in shades of gold and amber. Tokala was finally strong enough to sit up in bed, his wounded lung healing properly under Dr. Price's careful attention. The bullet scar would always mark his chest, but his breathing was clear and his strength was returning daily. Louisa sat beside his bed, reading from territorial newspapers that chronicled their victory. The headlines told a story of justice triumphant. Conrad Hale's criminal network exposed and destroyed his co-conspirators, facing lengthy prison sentences, his victims finally free to return to their families or build new lives. The Hale's trafficking ring broken by territorial marshals. She read aloud. 17 women rescued from forced captivity. 3 more locations raided based on evidence found at Black Mesa Mine. Tokala listened from his bed, propped up on pillows that allowed him to breathe without putting pressure on his healing chest. Despite his weakness, his eyes were alert and engaged, following every word. "What happens now?" he asked as she finished reading the latest account. Louisa smiled, pulling out a legal document that had arrived the previous day. "Judge Morrison has granted me full water rights to the entire Prairie Rose Creek watershed. The territorial government is also providing compensation for damages funded by the seizure of Hale's assets." It was overwhelming news, far beyond anything she'd dared dream when she'd first set out to file her father's simple homestead claim. But with the elation came responsibility. She now controlled resources that could determine the fate of dozens of families. "What will you do with it?" Tokala asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected her answer. "Share it," she replied without hesitation. "Water is life. It doesn't belong to any one person, no matter what the legal documents say. Prairie Rose Creek should flow free for everyone who needs it." That's what Papa would have wanted, she thought. Not an empire, but a community. Over the following days, as Tokala recovered his strength, they planned a future that would have seemed impossible weeks before. Prairie Rose Community would be an integrated settlement where Lakota and settler families shared resources and responsibilities, working together to build something unprecedented on the frontier. Beatrice had volunteered to establish a school for children of both cultures, her tragic experience with her father having given her a deep understanding of how hatred and prejudice could be passed from one generation to the next. Dr. Price would provide medical care for all residents, while Hawkeye would coordinate security and hunting activities. Most importantly, the water that had caused so much conflict would flow freely through the valley, supporting crops and livestock for families who had learned to see past the color of each other's skin. The wagon journey back to Prairie Rose Creek took 2 days, traveling slowly to accommodate Tokala's healing injuries. He rode in the back of the wagon, propped up on blankets and buffalo robes, but his eyes were bright with anticipation. When they finally crested the ridge above the valley, the sight that greeted them took Louisa's breath away. Where once there had been only her father's modest cabin and a few scattered outbuildings, now there was the beginning of a real community. Lakota lodges stood beside half-completed settler cabins, their smoke rising together into the clear autumn air. Children played together near the creek Lakota, and white children whose laughter knew no boundaries of race or culture. Their parents worked side by side, raising barns and digging irrigation channels that would serve everyone equally. 10 bears emerged from the largest lodge, his weathered face creasing into a smile as he saw the returning wagon. Behind him came Winema, her arms already reaching to help Tokala down from his makeshift bed. "Welcome home," the old chief said simply, but the words carried the weight of belonging that Louisa had been searching for her entire life. Home, she thought, tasting the word like honey. Not just a place, but a people. A family chosen rather than born. As winter deepened and the community took shape, the changes were remarkable. Disputes were settled through council meetings where both cultures had equal voice and representation. Work projects became shared enterprises, where Lakota knowledge of the land combined with settler engineering skills to create something better than either could achieve alone. Children attended Beatrice's integrated school, learning to read and write in both English and Lakota, studying the history and customs of both peoples. The young ones adapted quickly, but even the adults began to find common ground in their shared struggles against the harsh frontier. Prairie Rose Creek flowed freely through the valley, its water supporting gardens and crops for dozens of families. The old mining flume had been completely removed, its materials repurposed for bridges and irrigation channels that served the entire community rather than enriching a single man. Most importantly, the young women who had been rescued from Hale's trafficking ring were healing, supported by a community that understood the importance of providing safety and belonging to those who had lost both. Some chose to stay and build new lives, while others used the community as a way station on their journey back to their original homes. Spring arrived with the promise of new growth and fresh beginnings. As the first crops were planted in soil enriched by the free-flowing creek, Louisa stood on her cabin porch watching the sun set over Prairie Rose Creek. The water caught the light like liquid gold flowing peacefully toward horizons, where Lakota hunting grounds met settler farmland in harmony rather than conflict. Tokala emerged from the cabin, his limp barely noticeable now as his strength fully returned. The bullet scar would always mark his chest, but it had become just another part of his story, proof that some things were indeed worth fighting for. "Satisfied with your empire?" he asked with gentle humor, settling into the chair beside hers on the porch. "It's not an empire," she corrected, though she was smiling. "It's a home for all of us." From the settlement below came the sound of laughter, children playing beside the creek while their parents prepared the evening meal. It was the sound of hope made manifest of dreams, taking root in fertile soil. Beatrice appeared on the path from the schoolhouse, her arms full of books and her face bright with purpose. She had found peace by choosing to build something better than her father's legacy of violence and greed. The community had given her what she'd been seeking all her life, a chance to create rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm. She's free, Louisa realized. We're all free now. The battle for Prairie Rose Creek was over, but the work of nurturing what had grown from that victory would continue for generations. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Louisa knew with absolute certainty it was work worth doing. Water flowed free, community prospered, and the future stretched ahead with promise unlimited as the vast western sky itself. Justice had been served, love had triumphed over hatred, and the frontier had proven that people of different backgrounds could indeed build a better world together. In the distance, a nightbird called across the valley, its song carrying the music of hope into the infinite darkness. The story of Prairie Rose Creek had ended, but the legend of what could be achieved when good people stood together was just beginning. Tokala reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. No words were needed. They had found something worth more than water rights or land claims. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had found home.